Okay, so you know how you send us all that stuff about international data transfers?
Right.
The information from EMEA Abogados?
Yeah, yeah.
We're diving deep into that today.
Awesome.
It's going to be really interesting to sort of unpack all this and try to, like, figure out what the most important points are.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
you don't have to, wade through all that legalese.
Yeah, exactly.
Our mission today is to try to understand the key requirements and safeguards for international data transfers, as they're outlined in the material you gave us.
Right.
And it's clear from the get-go that the world is, like, so interconnected now. Data is just constantly flowing across borders.
All the time, yeah.
And the document emphasizes how these transfers are not just like a common thing, but they're essential.
Oh, absolutely. They're fundamental to how everything works these days.
Right. And at the same time, they emphasize protecting personal data, which makes sense.
Huge, yeah. You can't have one without the other, really.
So let's, like, define what we're talking about here when we say an international data transfer.
Okay, sure.
What does that actually mean?
So basically, an international data transfer happens when personal data is sent to someone outside the European Economic Area.
The EEA.
Right, exactly.
So that includes all the EU member states plus Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway.
Yep, those three as well.
So anything going beyond those borders to another country or even an international organization, that would be considered an international data transfer.
Exactly. And the GDPR is what governs these transfers?
Right. The General Data Protection Regulation.
It's like the rule book for making sure data is protected even when it leaves Europe.
It has to be adequate protection.
Right.
So the first thing they talk about is this adequacy decision.
Okay, so with an adequacy decision, the European Commission can look at a country or even just like a specific sector within a country
Oh, interesting.
and decide if their data protection laws are good enough, basically like on par with the GDPR.
So they're like, yep, they're doing things right over there.
Exactly. And if that happens, then transfers can just go ahead without any extra hoops to jump through.
Oh, so it's like a fast track.
Yeah, exactly.
And they give some specific examples like Switzerland, Canada, Argentina.
Yeah, Israel, Uruguay, Japan, the UK,
Oh, so those are all considered to have adequate protection.
according to the EU.
Yep. So if you're sending data to a company in, say, Japan,
Right.
it's all good because they've got that stamp of approval.
Exactly. It makes things much smoother.
But what if a country doesn't have one of these adequacy decisions?
Good question.
Then what?
Then you need to look at adequate safeguards.
Right. Because you can still transfer the data.
You can, but you have to make sure there are appropriate safeguards in place.
And the document lists a few different types.
Yeah, let's go through them.
Okay, the first one is standard contractual clauses.
That sounds super official.
It does.
What are those exactly?
So basically, they're like pre-approved contracts developed by the European Commission.
Okay.
They lay out all the data protection obligations for both the sender and receiver of the data. So even though the data is going to a country without an adequacy decision,
These clauses make sure it's still handled properly, like according to GDPR standards.
so it's like a legally binding promise to protect the data.
Exactly.
Okay, then there's binding corporate rules or BCRs.
Yeah, those are more for big multinational companies.
I was thinking that.
They're basically internal data protection policies for the whole company group. So it doesn't matter where the data is being transferred within the company.
Right.
The same rules apply.
And those have to be approved by EU data protection authorities, right?
Right. They need to make sure the rules are strict enough.
So it's like these companies are saying we take data protection seriously.
Yeah, exactly. We've got our own GDPR compliant framework in place.
Then they mention codes of conduct and certification mechanisms.
Right. So codes of conduct are like industry-specific standards for data protection.
Like a set of best practices for a certain sector.
Exactly. And certification mechanisms are a way for companies to prove they're following the rules.
Okay, so they're like getting certified to show they're GDPR compliant.
Right. And that can be helpful for international transfers.
But it seems like those standard contractual clauses and BCRs are the most common safeguards.
Yeah, definitely.
So we've got adequacy decisions, the easy route, and these safeguards if a country isn't considered adequate.
Right.
But then they talk about a third condition, exceptions for specific situations.
Yeah, so sometimes a data transfer can happen even without an adequacy decision or those safeguards.
That seems like a loophole.
Not really. They're very specific scenarios where the transfer is absolutely necessary.
Okay, so what kind of situations are we talking about?
Well, one is if the person whose data is being transferred gives their explicit consent.
So they have to clearly agree to it, knowing all the risks.
Exactly. It can't be sneaky consent.
Right.
Another exception is if the transfer is necessary for a contract.
Like if you buy something online from a company outside the EEA.
Yeah, they need your address and payment info to send you the order.
That makes sense.
But sometimes it's tricky to figure out if it's really necessary for the contract.
All right, like with all these digital services, it's not always clear.
Exactly.
What other exceptions are there?
Well, if the transfer is needed to protect someone's life or health.
Like a medical emergency.
Right, then it can be allowed even without consent.
So those are the main exceptions.
Yeah, but remember, they're only for very specific situations.
You can't just use them as a way to avoid the rules.
Right.
Okay, so we've got those three pathways: adequacy decisions, safeguards, or exceptions.
Exactly.
But then the document goes on to talk about crucial additional safeguards.
So even if you meet one of those first three conditions...
You still need to go further.
Right, you need extra layers of security.
The first one they mentioned is DPIAs.
Data Protection Impact Assessments.
We've talked about those before.
Yeah, so a DPIA is basically a risk assessment for data transfers.
So you're looking at the potential risks to people's privacy.
Right, and figuring out how to mitigate them.
And this is even if you have things like standard contractual clauses.
Yeah, because every transfer is different.
Yeah. You might need extra technical measures on top of those clauses.
Exactly. It's about being thorough.
Then there are technical and organizational measures.
That sounds pretty broad.
It does. What kinds of things fall under that category?
Well, technical measures are things like encryption.
Making sure the data is unreadable to anyone who shouldn't see it.
Right. And you have to consider how strong the encryption is and where the keys are kept.
Right. That's important.
Another technical measure is pseudonymization.
Replacing identifying information with a code.
Right. So even if the data is breached.
The person can't be identified.
Exactly.
What about organizational measures?
Those are about policies and procedures like access controls.
Making sure only authorized people can access the data.
Right. And data minimization.
Only collecting the data you absolutely need.
Exactly. And these measures are important both during the transfer and after the data arrives in the other country.
So it's not just about getting it there safely.
It's about protecting it once it's there, too.
And finally, they talk about supervision and audit.
Right. These are ongoing processes.
So you're not just setting things up and forgetting about it.
Exactly. You need to keep monitoring and checking.
Supervision is like continuous monitoring, right?
Yeah, making sure everything is working as it should.
And audits are more in-depth reviews.
Right. They happen periodically to make sure you're still compliant with the rules.
So it's all about ensuring ongoing data protection.
Yeah, especially with international transfers.
This has been really helpful in breaking down all these complex regulations.
I'm glad it's useful.
But why should our listeners care about all this?
That's a good question.
Like, why is it important for individuals to understand these rules?
Well, as the document points out, international data transfers are essential for so much these days.
Right. The world runs on data.
Exactly. Every time you use social media, book a flight, shop online, your data is probably crossing borders.
It's crazy to think about.
So understanding these regulations helps you know how your data is being protected.
And it's not just about legal compliance for companies either.
Right. It's also about trust.
If companies are transparent and follow the rules,
it shows they care about protecting your data.
And that builds trust with their users.
Exactly.
So let's recap the three main pathways for international data transfers.
Okay.
First, the destination country has adequate data protection.
Right, like the examples we talked about.
Second, there are safeguards in place, like those standard contractual clauses.
Or BCRs.
And third, there's a specific exception that applies.
Right, like consent or protecting someone's vital interests.
And even when those conditions are met, you still need those additional safeguards.
DPIAs, technical and organizational measures, supervision, and audit.
It's a lot to think about.
It is, but it's important.
Because our data is constantly being sent all over the world.
That's the reality we live in.
So here's a question for our listeners. What aspects of these regulations do you find most important?
Yeah, what gives you the most peace of mind when it comes to your data?
It's something to consider as you navigate the digital world. And just so you know, the information we discussed today is based on the material from MCHM Abogados.
Right.
So thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
Until next time, bye.